Hey, it's Drybear. Back again with another Diablo 4 build guide, and today we're going to talk about the Immortal Severance Necro build, which focuses on Sever as a primary for your shadow damage build. I finally managed to get a build to work that relies on double curses, because there is a way to modify that to give drastically increased damage, but only for shadows. This is a shadow-focused build, but this one I'm pretty excited about. But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream live on Twitch, twitch.tv/Drybear. Come hang out with me and the community. If you don't come hang out, the next time you're stuck in traffic, the person directly behind you is going to honk their horn. When you look at them through your rear view mirror, you won't be able to tell whether they did it intentionally or not, and you'll always wonder whether they were honking at you or just accidentally honking. All right, let's talk about Immortal Severance Necro, and yes, that is a reference to Sekiro. This focuses on using Sever. I've been trying to get a Sever build to work. There are options to mix this in different ways, but I think this is actually the best Sever build that I've been able to make. And finally, I get the opportunity to use double curses. Decrepify and Iron Maiden together, they have their uses, but they're not as strong as curses were in Diablo 2 in general. But in this case, I think you can really put them together because there is a legendary that allows you to, when you have a target that is cursed by both, it drastically increases your shadow damage to that target. So as long as we're doing shadow damage, we're getting a big benefit, and we can benefit from both of the curses and their modifiers. Luckily for you, I've made this entire build on d4builds.gg, which includes skill tree, gear, legendaries, gems, as well as the Paragon, a first pass at the Paragon board for this build. So if you like this build, you like using Sever, you like using Shadow, all this is going to be available for you down in the description. You can also join my Discord. I have a D4 Builds channel that has all of my builds all in one pinned post. You can find that there, and you can also have other people to chat about Diablo 4 with, and as well as other games. But let's dive into the build. So this is a shadow damage focused build. We're going to be building up our shadow damage, and usually when we were making a choice for what builder we want to choose, we will always go with the one that fits our build best, that modifies it. And in this case, I actually do believe that it is Reap. Reap is a semi-melee ability with damage in front, and it has some nice modifiers and some legendaries that can really make it all come together once we have it. So this is going to be our builder. Hitting an enemy and gives you damage reduction, which is nice for up close damage as well. You also get attack speed. Any of the melee style abilities, attack speed goes a long way because it means you can move sooner, you can reposition sooner, and it allows you to build more. Attack speed goes a long way for both Reap and for Sever. And Reap instantly kills enemy below 5% life. This one is kind of just a nice bonus when you're hitting lots of AoE targets. There isn't really a great choice here. You can do corpses if you go for an alternate build with corpse consumption. But in general, I think that either one of these probably parse about the same. There isn't really a huge over-under on one of these being better than the other. When it comes to passives in the core tree, since we are a caster build here, anytime you're on a caster build, you do want to consider running resource management because you're going to be using your resources excessively. More resources means more damage. Picking up at least 1 point in Unliving, and then picking up in Perfectly Balanced because we have some more shadow choices that we're going to make later in the tree. And then, of course, the star of the build, the primary motor function for this is going to be Sever, which you shoot a scythe forward, it does damage, and returns to you. And we have tons of really cool ways to modify what this does as it travels. We're going to pick up the one that makes it so that it damages enemies along its path for its initial damage as well, and also every fourth cast makes enemies vulnerable. So if we get a good level of resource generation and we get Severs flying up into the air, we can actually get a really fun boomerang style build going just from the Sever. Then going to the next defensive build tree, we want to pick up Blood Mist here. And I actually struggled to find a good item option, a good ability option to fit into the slot. And I do believe it is Blood Mist for several reasons. One, it is a nice defensive because you become untargetable, so you can avoid major attacks. You can stay in position for boss fights when you're in a pinch, and it does heal you as well. Casting a skill that overpowers reduces the cooldown. This doesn't affect us too much. There is a base overpower chance in every character, but we're not going to be building for it, so you're not going to get too much value out of this, but you have to pick it in order to fork the build. And you do want the Fortify as well, which is pretty nice. We're also going to pick up a legendary that causes Blood Mist to deal shadow damage, which is really nice. Which gives us more scaling on that shadow damage bonus, which is really cool. Down here to the double curse. This is really exciting. Now, you can run less points into Decrepify. There's not really too much value in putting points into Decrepify. You get more slow value, which is useful for enemies that can be slowed and helps them stay in all your AoE, shadow, effects longer, which gives you more value, which is nice. And it gives a little bit of damage reduction, but you can pull points off here if you want to try and get more. Likely there's going to be more value in picking up Death's Reach and Death's Embrace here, but just as a basic build, picking up these here. We're going to pick up Iron Maiden. This one does, it's basically like a reverse Thorns effect on the target. You can also make it so that when you cast Iron Maiden, it doesn't cost Essence, which is nice. More Essence means more Severs, which is really cool. And it also means that for each enemy that's cursed, you get more Essence back. So it becomes an Essence generator. So casting this on targets does give you that benefit. And we also want to make it so that the damage is increased. Again, your main source of damage is going to be from the Curse Amplify and the Legendary Curse Amplify. So putting points here, you may be able to reclaim these points for more passives or more things along the lines. But just for this, just kind of these things, it does help quite a bit. Picking up Amplified Damage means we deal damage to cursed enemies. 3 damage there. We're going to run the Legendary that we'll talk about in a second as well. And then Decrepify is your other curse. It slows target and causes them to deal less damage, which is indirect damage reduction. You have a lucky hit on them to stun, and then you also have a lucky hit for them to reduce active cooldowns when you hit enemies that are affected by Decrepify, and you're going to be hitting them a lot. We have Shadow Dots, we have persistent AoEs, we have flying projectiles. We're going to be hitting very regularly, and running at least a little bit of lucky hit in this build will give you some pretty good cooldown reduction, which is pretty awesome. Going into the next tree, we don't need any of these. We don't need Corpse Tendrils or Bone Spirit for this build, but we will be picking up all of the Shadow passives because there's some really cool things going on here. When you damage enemies with Darkness skills, Sever and Reap are your primary. You're going to be getting movement speed. Great for things like Reap, where you will be in melee range. Repositioning, attack speed, movement speed are valuable for that. Picking up Gloom means that when you damage enemies with Darkness skills, your Builder and your Spender, they take increased shadow damage from you and your minions for 2 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. And keep in mind, we're going to modify Blood Wave to do shadow damage as well, so that will proc these when you cast your ultimate too. And of course, Blood Mist is going to deal shadow damage too. So actually 4 of your abilities are doing shadow damage by themselves. Terror is great, gives Darkness skills deal bonus damage to enemies who are slowed. Remember, we're slowing them with Decrepify, which is very easy. We want to be cursing them anyways. And it gives another bonus if they're stunned or immobilized. Again, we're going to be causing them to be stunned with various effects. So we get that double extra damage bonus. They stack and apply shadow damage dealt by your minions as well, which is really cool. And Darkness skills have a chance to stun. We get bonus damage from stun. All of that works really well together. Next, for ultimate, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up Blood Wave. This one is multifaceted in its usage. Not only is it decent for damage output, at base it does blood, it conjures a big wave that goes forward, knocks enemies back, and does damage. You also slow enemies, gives us a chance to do more bonus damage in that crowd control category, and it leaves behind blood orbs, so you're spawning blood orbs on your own. And we're going to have some Paragon effects that will benefit from that and be able to use those as we go further into the build, and we'll talk about Paragon in just a minute. So Blood Wave's going to be your ultimate, and remember, we're going to turn this into shadow damage. And lastly, we're going to pick up Shadow Blight. Shadow damage infects enemies with a dot. Shadow Blight for 2 seconds. You and your minions deal bonus damage to enemies with Shadow Blight. Every 10th time an enemy receives shadow damage from you or your minions while they're affected by Shadow Blight, they take an additional 20% shadow damage. So when we have ticking damage, we're going to have a persistent AoE coming from Blood Mist. We're going to have Sever flying around the air, Reap going around in the air. We're going to have all these shadow effects plus shadow dot damage. This is going to be triggering like crazy. You're going to see numbers all over the screen, spreading miasma and darkness, consuming everything in your way. It's really, really fun to watch. So that's the option there. Let's talk about legendaries and how these get modified. And let's talk about the minions as well. I think in this build, there's still a question that I would have to test at full endgame to see. I think you run for full sacrifice here. I don't think there's room in the build to fully build out enough survivability for your minions to keep them alive, or enough corpse generation and consumption to keep them alive. So I think you're better off just having the bonuses. It is possible that you could run Shadow Mages with this build, because that will give you bigger procs on Shadow. It'll proc Shadow Blight and give you more synergy there. I'm just concerned that until I get to test this at full endgame, whether or not you're going to be able to keep the Shadow Mages alive for them to have enough value to warrant them being on your bar. And in this case, I think you can't really fit it. So sacrifice everything. My recommendation is to sacrifice your Reapers on the warrior side to get increased shadow damage. Scales all of your shadow damage, and almost everything you do does shadow damage, which is awesome. Sacrifice the cold mages to get vulnerable bonus, and we have plenty of ways to cause vulnerable, more damage amp for all of our shadow abilities. And then increase attack speed by sacrificing the bone golem means that we can use things like reap and sever a lot easier, and we can reposition after doing them. Trust me, if you've played reap for more than a couple minutes, you'll notice the difference that you get from having attack speed in the build. It feels significantly better, and your survivability goes up because you can reap and then move and get out of the way and reposition. You can kite better, and it makes reap a lot more usable when you have a certain amount of attack speed. Let's talk about uniques first, because those are going to be the hardest things to get. Keep in mind, you won't have these for quite a while when you first start playing, but you will work your way towards them, and they are really, really fun to play with. In this build, unfortunately, my nemesis, the Harlequin Crest, this is kind of like this is good for everything unique. It's generally very good. It beats out all the legendaries that fit into the helm slot for this build, so we're going to pick it up. It gives you some nice damage reduction, and it gives you +4 ranks to all of your skills, which is going to scale up all of their orange numbers to give you more damage. It scales sever damage, reap damage. It's going to give you more healing on your blood mist and less cooldown, things like that. So that's all really good. So Harlequin Crest is an easy, unique pickup. In the meantime, until you get this, you can run any legendary that fits, any damage reduction, defense, or offense, even just getting like accelerated legendary for your basic skills having more attack speed. We talked about reap needing attack speed, so all of that works really well together. For chest armor, there isn't a slam dunk victory here, but one that I would recommend is Aspect of Shared Misery. This is going to help you a lot in mobbing and trash. This just makes your crowd control spread when you hit a target that is crowd controlled. This isn't going to affect your bossing too much, and you may need to slot something else in here. The problem is that the chest is really mostly about, like chest and legs is a lot about survivability. So you're not going to get damage out of that. You're kind of forced in that category. So picking up something like Shared Misery, I think, is a good bet, but there's going to be flexibility on what you put in that slot. For gloves, you want to pick up Aspect of Empowering Reaper. This is a legendary that you need, but it is competitive because it goes into the popular slots, weapon, offhand, and accessories. So being able to slot this on gloves is a nice boon. This means that crit strikes from Sever have a chance to spawn a pool of Blight under the target that deals bonus damage. This effect only happens once every 3 seconds. Another option for chest, by the way, is you could run with the Blight legendary that causes it to suck enemies in, which is really nice. So the Blight that you spawn from Sever will then pull targets in. You can curse them easier. You can do more damage. So that's another option for you for the chest slot. When it comes to pants, damage reduction is really big for this build because you will be getting pretty close to targets. And then you'll be spreading your darkness everywhere. You will have to position, so free damage reduction is kind of nice. And in builds where you do cast basic skills regularly, Aspect of Might is actually pretty valuable, and you will be casting Reap pretty often. Lastly, the other unique is the Greaves of the Empty Tomb. This one is so cool. Create desecrated ground beneath your Sever Specters as they travel, damaging enemies for shadow damage. Even more shadow damage. We already talked about all the synergies you get from shadow. We're scaling shadow damage up. We have procs that when you do shadow damage, you have ways to trigger more bonuses from shadow. All of that is great. And with this unique, you can see how the end game build for this gets even more interesting. You can now, Sever creates massive AoEs as it goes along, and it also creates shadow damage options for you. For the weapon slot, I would recommend Aspect of Ultimate Shadow. This is the one that turns Blood Wave into a darkness skill. And on top of that, it makes Blood Wave create more shadow pools on the ground as it travels. So you have your shadow pools being created from your Sever as it's traveling. You have shadow pools created from the giant shadow tsunami that's going through, dealing darkness damage and creating shadow. There's even more shadow. Remember, all your shadow damage applies a shadow dot to them, so there's more shadow coming out of it. All of this is really cool, but I'm not done. Aspect of Decay makes it so that and I would put this in Amulet, each time the Shadow Blight key passive, the dot, damages enemies, it increases the next Shadow Blight's damage within 10 seconds by a significant portion, stacking up to 5 times. This means that your Shadow dot damage on single target in extended fights gets significantly better. Aspect of Decay is a huge pickup for you for this build when you have so much shadow damage baked in. For rings, I recommend Aspect of the Damned. You deal increased shadow damage to enemies afflicted by both Decrepify and Iron Maiden. This is the first build that I've managed to include both curses in for this very reason, because you just can't give up 2 slots for that. But I think in this case, because everything you do is based on shadow damage, getting 40% shadow damage as a global scaler when you double curse a target is so sexy. We love it. We want it. We want it in the build. The next ring we're going to pick up is the Blighted aspect. You deal increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. And remember, you can apply Shadow Blight from dealing shadow damage. So when you're mobbing and doing large rooms, throwing out your giant blood wave that does darkness and applies shadow dot and leaves a shadow pool, throwing out your sever that leaves a shadow pool, all of your shadow damage coming out from that will apply Shadow Blight. And every time Shadow Blight deals damage, and you have Shadow Blights everywhere, it increases your damage by a significant amount. So everything's just melting. And then for offhand, I would recommend picking up Blood Mist, Blood-Soaked aspect. This one, Blood Mist leaves a trail that lasts for 4 seconds and deals shadow damage per second to enemies who stand in it, and your movement speed is no longer reduced while Blood Mist is active. So when you have this legendary, you move at full speed while using Blood Mist, and Blood Mist spawns shadow pools. You got shadow pools on shadow pools on shadow pools with severs flying all over the place, reaps going down, giant tsunamis of shadow, shadow. All of it works really well together, and it's super, you can see now why I'm pretty excited about it. So those are legendaries. For gems, I would recommend picking up damage over time because you have so much from Shadow Blight in this. You can pick up maximum life and armor just to survive on this. Very easy for the gem choices there. Next, let's talk about Paragon, and this includes Asterisk. This is my first pass on the Paragon build for the Immortal Severance build. I will likely have to update this once I can play this build for an extended period of time at endgame and really test it out, but this is my first pass on it in general. When it comes to stats for Necromancers, for this build, we're going to want Intelligence and Willpower. We don't need crit, it's a dot build, so we're going to go for the resource generation that Willpower gives us. Remember that the stats provide different benefits for each class, so depending on your class, each stat will do something slightly different. So, Dexterity may be, you may think of it naturally as like a rogue skill or a rogue stat, but it changes based on the class. So for this build and Necromancer in general, Willpower will give you resource generation for more severs, Intelligence will give you skill damage, and that's what we care about in this build. We want scaling skill damage for our big dots, and we want more resource generation. So let's quickly run through this Paragon board. Remember, this is a first pass. This will likely need modifications, but we'll talk through the reasoning here. The first board is your starting board. You get this for your first bit of Paragon after level 50. For the first glyph I would pick up Amplify. Increases the magic nodes in range, which is really nice. All of these blue ones will scale up by 50%. More percent damage for global scaling and all that. And the additional bonus is when you have 40 intelligence in the area, you can actually get enemies affected by curse skills take 10% increased damage from you. So you get extra shadow damage and all that. You just need to be able to get. And once you have this glyph, you may want to reclaim some stats to get this online. I skip this for now as you're leveling, because you won't really be able to benefit from this too much. But keep in mind that to get this bonus passive, you need 40 intelligence, which means you need 8 of these +5 intelligence nodes, which there are 9 in this glyph segment. So you may want to pick this up later once you have the glyph, you have it equipped, and you have your full curse build online. Attached to this is going to be Scent of Death, your shadow damage build here. This is going to be one of your best ones, as well as Wither. Sorry, Wither is your shadow damage bonus. But Wither's going to be your best board, but I think it's better just to kind of come up here for the glyphs. And I had to make some adjustments for where the glyphs were located. So Wither is your best board for shadow damage. You're going to spend the most amount of points on this board. But we're going to start with Scent of Death because it connects really cleanly together. We're going to come up here. We're not going to pick up the passive here because we're not going to be able to deal with corpses the way we would likely want to in normal builds. We're going to grab all these stats. You want to pick up these damage to injured enemies. This is a uptime DPS tick-based build. Anytime you have DPS-focused builds, damage to injured enemies, the value of that goes up because you're not bursting them down from high to low. They're ticking down, which means every instance of damage gets scaled up when they become injured. Super cool. We have an option for a glyph slot here. I recommend getting the darkness one, which is every 5 willpower within range, you deal increased shadow damage. And if you have at least 25 willpower located, whenever you or minions deal shadow damage, that damage they deal 2% less damage to you, which is nice. The reason we move this over is just because sometimes in the glyph spots, you may not have the stats available to activate the passive. So in this case, we move this over here just so we can get that up. But we still get damage to injured enemies, which works for our dots and some defense as well. And then we dip out a Scent of Death because we're done there. Moving over into our primary board, Wither. This is your shadow damage board. This one's really good. You want to go over here and you grab all the damage reduction from enemies that are shadow dotted. This may not seem like it makes sense early on, but as you push later content, the survivability is going to be clutch. You're always going to be dealing shadow damage to the targets. Shadow damage, shadow damage, shadow damage over time. Great pickups here. We want to get a little bit more intelligence here, but remember, when we adjust our build later in the game for having more intelligence for this trigger, we're going to drop some of the willpower that we have here in order to activate the glyph here and the piece here for more intelligence, which gives us more shadow damage over time. So think about that as a coming. Once you get your build fully optimized, you may want to swap down and reclaim some of that intelligence. The glyph inside the withered board, I would recommend sacrificial. Grant 50% bonus to all the blue nodes around here. Shadow resistance for defense, which is really nice, and percent shadow damage for all your scaling, which is great. You get the willpower scale for shadow damage here, and of course, we're going to miss out on the extra shadow resistance, but we want more damage than resistance in general. And of course, we want to pick up damage to shadow dot enemies. Almost every enemy you fight is going to be shadow dotted. All that works great. And because this is our primary board, we do want to pick up the legendary node, Wither, which means that shadow damage over time effects have a chance to deal bonus damage each time they deal damage, and the chance is increased for each 50 willpower you have. So as you stack willpower, again, this is a willpower intelligence build, you're going to get a bunch of value out of this, but shadow damage over time effects like Shadow Blight will get stronger and stronger and stronger and hit multiple times. Coming out from here, we're going to go into Flesh Eater. We don't need the legendary node here, but it does have some useful options here. It has one of the best glyph spots for any caster build for Necromancer in general. So we're going to come up, we're going to get the lucky chance to execute non-injured enemies, but we're also really going to want the attack speed for Reap. Feels really good. Helps Sever as well. You can probably skip out on some of these here, like go over, skip this middle one for a chance to execute. It's not super valuable, but you have Reap there, which is really nice, and you can get some bonus execute, and it will start to stack up once you get to a certain amount of attack speed. Come up to the glyph slot, we're going to pick up Scourge. For every 5 willpower purchased within range, you deal increased shadow damage over time, and you and your minions, which you have none, you deal increased damage to enemies affected by shadow dots. Again, more shadow scalers. But to get that bonus, we need 25 willpower, so we're going to grab that by getting 5 willpower nodes, which we have, and then we're going to pick up these damage to elites, which is a nice scaler on top of that, and then get some defense in this node as well. You can skip on these to reclaim some points if you really need to, but I think this is the better bet to go until you fully optimize your build for endgame. And lastly, we have Bone Graft on here. We're not going to get any bone bonuses here. The reason we even have this board attached the way we do here is because Bone Graft has one of my favorite node clusters for any Necrocaster builds right here in the corner. These nodes are so amazing for caster builds. This increases your maximum essence by a large amount, especially if you have a lot of willpower, you get that bonus there. But it also gives you essence back on kill. So when you're mobbing, getting 2 essence back every time you kill any enemy feels really good, especially when you're clearing rooms. So we're going to come up here, get some extra stats, some willpower as we go along, and then grab these nodes just for the extra little bit, and we can scale up the willpower as well. So that is my first draft on the Paragon boards for the Immortal Severance build. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you're running this build on launch for Necro. I'm super excited about this one. I'm finally glad that I was finally able to put together some of the pieces I've been wanting to use for Necro, but haven't really been able to find a home for it until now. Enjoy the video, leave a like down below. It helps me out tremendously. Leave a comment as well. Tell me what you think about this build. Tell me how you would improve it, or where you see holes that can get better, or what you like about it. Anyways, it helps the algorithm, helps me out in general, and check me out on my live stream as well. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.